Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're asking, is Google too powerful? We're talking about on a day when the French president's been meeting with the CEO of Google over a plan to perhaps tax links to French news sites, one that, according to some sources, that could go into effect as early as next January. Google's threatened to pull the plug on those French news sites. With us to talk about it from New York, Jeff Jarvis, author of What Would Google Do? Here in the studio, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, columnist at French News Weekly, Le Nouvel Observateur, and also Le Plus, the Nouvel Observateur's interactive website. Also with us, Olivia Philippe, editor-in-chief of online news site JOL Press, and Waddick Doyle of the American University of Paris's School of Communications. The sponsor of the bill in the French Senate admits it, technology, he says, has gone faster than the tax code, and that's the problem.
My proposal targets online advertising agencies, both in France and abroad, and aims to establish a small 0.5% tax on their advertising revenue, and seeks, above all, to ensure they declare their advertising revenue, their profits made in France.
Jeff Jarvis, there's money being made somewhere that's not getting around to the tax man.
Well, that's a different question about your tax laws and how the tax laws work than this. The idea of just taxing Google because it's successful, I would question the very title of this whole segment. Is Google too powerful? I would ask whether media are too powerful that they can make government into their lackey to try to go after new competitors in unfair ways. That's what's really happening here. It is absolutely absurd. And the problem here is that the danger is that we're trying to perhaps regulate this internet before we know what it is. I'll go back to the idea of Gutenberg in the press and say that we don't know what this thing is yet, and it's too soon to regulate it. When I faced President Sarkozy at the EG8 he held in Paris about a year ago, I asked him to take a Hippocratic oath for the net and first do no harm. What's happening here is that we have government regulators coming in trying to push off the change and disruption of the future using their power to do so. So it's not Google that's too powerful, it's media and government together that are clearly far too powerful.
One weekend, though, was all it took for newspapers in Belgium, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, to cave in and forego compensation for the use of Google News last year.
And the problem is in France, we spend maybe more than 1 billion euros to help the press. The government is spending 1 billion euros each year to help the press. So if taxing Google means that we can spend a little less, maybe the government is willing to support that new tax in order to alleviate its own charges. That's one point we could make in this debate. And the other thing is that, to answer Jeff Jarvis, it's one thing to be successful. It's another thing. You have to pay taxes when you're successful anyway. And in France, Google is making more than 1 billion euros in profits with its advertising, and they pay a ridiculous amount of taxes, and they pay it in Ireland. So we have a problem with that too. And maybe we can have common ground saying that the real debate should be on that part of what Google is not paying instead of taxing the links. Maybe we should tax them more on their profits, which would be fair. We are in a huge economic crisis here. I mean, it's really a dire economic situation. And it's the case in France as it is the case in the US, I guess. So being new is not the only thing to take into account. Also to talk to Jeff Jarvis, this is not, if you're new, you have to pay taxes anyway. You have to go by the rules.
Olivier Philippe, you were saying before we went on air, you were wondering at least, is it a problem of Google not paying its tax, or is it a problem of the European Union failing so far to succeed in having tax harmonization, just of the general broad tax code?
Well, that's all that is has to be thought all together. But I agree with Philippe that the real question could be to think that Google should pay the taxes on the profits in every country Google is, and not depending from the place where Google is going to make his domiciliation, because this is something very much like being in the Bermudes. You see, you can say, I'm making a car, I'm selling my car here in France, but I put my domiciliation in the Bermudes and I don't pay taxes. So the problem with all the digital companies is that they have the power to say, my business is partly here, so I'm going to pay my tax in that country and not a lot in this other.
Google sends its tax, all of its income cycles not really through, it goes through Ireland, but then it goes to the Bermudas and comes back. I think through 367 million euros profit in 2009, they paid something like 2 million tax. I don't remember the exact figure, but it's a very low level
Sorry,
of tax.
I was making a joke. I was not saying that Google was escaping any taxes. I was just saying that at a point when you're making some profit, some business in one country, it could be fair to imagine that you're going to pay the taxes in the country where you're making the business. And where the profit that you're making in Italy, you're going to pay the taxes on that part of profit and all that like that. So that's a question which could be.
And for you, that's not happening with Google?
No, because we know that most of the profit that they are doing in France is not included in the base of the payment of the taxes, and most of the domiciliation is in Ireland, I think.
That's
so
right.
there is something which maybe not
Google
exactly
France
fair.
is an agent for Google Ireland, or Google
Exactly.
UK is an agent
Exactly.
for Google Ireland.
So
All the profits
that
are
it could
going
be
to
the
Ireland,
question.
So they don't pay anything on their advertising profits that they've made in France. They don't pay anything.
They don't actually stay that long in Ireland. They go back to the Bermudas and come to Ireland.
You have to be socially responsible. I mean.
The tax issue, has it been brought up in the United States as well, Jeff Jarvis?
Well, not so much here because they're based here, but this is a matter of tax laws around the world. If you are a public company, you have a responsibility to operate as efficiently as you can, and they take advantage of the laws that do exist. A company that voluntarily chose to pay more and have less profit would be sued by its shareholders. That's an issue of the laws that we have, and I'm not disagreeing with anything that's just been said about where taxes should be paid. But this is a matter of the laws that exist and the way that public companies operate. But there's also another point here, which is that the notion of a nation is going to be challenged here. Boundaries and borders are going to become more and more meaningless as our information goes across the world.
The problem is that nations don't agree with that. You can change all our cultural habits, the way the press goes, plus not paying any tax and asking for it as a service to the community. It's strange. It's a strange way of doing things.
Well, Mr. Jarvis, the question is, where is the sovereignty? Who has sovereignty?
That's exactly the question. And I would argue what I said to President Sarkozy was I begged him not to plant his flag in the internet as if it were an eighth continent and a new nation.
So the
point of the internet,
moves to Google.
let me finish. The definition of the internet, the way it operates, is that no one has sovereignty over it. And if anyone claims sovereignty over it, then so will Iran and so will China, and there will go our free speech with the lowest freedom.
China effectively has sovereignty over its internet because A, of its firewall, and B, the way it protects Beidou.
And do you think that's admirable? And do you think that is an admirable model? Is that an admirable model? That's what we should be evoking here in France too? I hope not.
No, we won't have a protected internet in France.
We don't want that. We don't want that. But what we do want is a system where Google itself is not behaving as though it is a sovereign state. Which it now does behave with its own laws.
How is it doing that? How is it doing that? How?
How is it providing?
You're just being anti. And Google says you're going all over the map, folks. How is it being acting as a state? I don't see that.
I mean, he goes and visits our head of state, who is not, by the way, Sarkozy anymore, but François Hollande, and is visiting him.
I know, obviously, I didn't see Mr. Hollande. I saw Mr. Sarkozy. Of course, I know that.
Jeff Jarvis, part of the ruffled...
the attitude.
There were ruffled feathers following this story because even though, again, and we got to stress this point, this meeting between Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, and François Hollande, the president of France, was long planned. But over the weekend, there had been a manifesto by some 90 business leaders here in France calling for the French to ease off, calling for the French government to ease off on payroll tax. And instead, the first business leader is invited to the presidential palace. Coincidence, the calendar is the CEO of Google. There is this sentiment, and it touches upon another issue, which is there is a resentment that's existed there for years between past French presidents and Google. Jacques Chirac at one point even suggesting the creation of a rival search engine, and he said it bluntly, that wasn't Anglo-Saxon, as he put it.
Why should I not take insult at that? Why should it? So it's very anti-American, anti-big business, anti-Google. I hear you going all over the map. You go after Google for links. You go after Google.
No, but my question to you, Jeff Jarvis,
what's
is this:
What's so bad about Google?
Yeah, my question
you don't want to use it, don't use it.
My question is: when you came to France, when you met with Nicolas Sarkozy, did you feel this anti-Anglo-Saxon sentiment?
Yes, I did. And I think anti-business, anti-big business, anti-technology. And that's because France really want to be known for that.
Sarkozy was not anti-big business. He was trying to protect the national interest. You have to think about our national economic interest. You can ask from Sarkozy to renounce our economic interest.
What you're dealing with, though, is the problem of globalization. Yeah. In the United States, you have a model of democracy, where democracy is preserved by the fact that private media do not have government interference because they're funded by advertising. This is the model that was set up after the Second World War. In France, in Sweden, in many countries in Western Europe, you have a system where the state subsidizes minority media because the idea is the state has to ensure a pluralism of views. It's a very different model. But with globalization, these models have difficulty surviving. And the problem is that Google doesn't produce content, it's a vector. But power has moved from those who produce content to vectors. And there's little to regulate them. And that's a problem.
Why
because
regulate
governments
them?
are
Why?
elected.
Why?
Governments are elected and represent. Governments are democratically elected and recognized by their people. They represent the people who vote for them.
Why
we did not vote for Google.
If we go to the point, the real problem is the French press is really ill. It doesn't go well. And we see this huge amount of advertising going to Google, so they ask for a share of it. That's the base point of the debate. That's that. Sharing the profits of advertising between Google and the French medias. And either we have a way to talk about it and to find an understanding, and there will be an understanding, or there won't be.
Why should there be this presumption of sharing? If they succeeded where you failed, why should you have to give over to the failures?
Because most of the situation like Italy, where one media mogul can eventually take over the government because he controls the sources of advertising revenue. That, after all, did happen in Italy.
Yeah, there is the issue of critical mass. Google controls some 70% of the internet search market. 2/3 of the world's smartphones use the Android operating system. Regulators on both sides of the Atlantic are looking into whether or not there is unfair competition at hand. Some lawmakers simply pointing, as was the case during a panel in which Eric Schmidt participated last year in Congress, pointing just to Google's size and business model.
I am admittedly skeptical of big companies that simultaneously control both information and the distribution channels to that information. And for me, that is at the heart of the problem here.
Olivier Philippe, do you think there is a problem here?
Yes, that's definitely a question. Like they say, there's probably now a new sovereignty. The power was in the nations. After, we can say that since maybe 10 years, the power came to banks. But now the banks are involved in a lot of crises. And maybe now the power is inside these very big digital companies like Google, Facebook, and so there is probably a question now that's a real democratic question to think about the maybe regulation. This is not a good word, but to rules, limits, and the problem of the super power and exclusivity that these big brands have now on the market. So that's the question, and that's not one country which can answer. That's probably a big global thinking, negotiation, agreement, maybe with the United Nations. But that's probably the next question. But I wanted to say something else. We put the statement that Google never produced any content. But there is also another thesis, is that maybe the next step Google will do and will produce content. With Google TV, we can think that maybe they are going to be themselves involved inside the content. So this first question about regulation can be much more important if at one point they have the power on the distribution, we can call that like that, and the production. And maybe one day Google will buy the New York Times, and for not very much.
We could end up with
money.
a monopolistic news company. We would both produce the news
exactly.
and
That
distribute
would be
it.
an hypothesis.
That's true.
Jeff Jarvis, a final word on this?
Well, what ridiculous speculation that is. Google does not produce content because it does, in
Now
fact,
you have the
act
attitude.
as a vector. And let me leave you with this. I don't need your media to tell you that it is now raining in New York.
But if you want to know a little more than rain in New York, if you want to know what happens in Syria, you have to be medias you pay for with real journalists. I mean, except if you actually live in Syria and can show us what's happening in your street now.
And I train them, but I also try to find new business models for them, and that doesn't mean the old
the
monopoly.
problem is we didn't
models
find
that
Let
they
Jeff
made.
Jarvis finish here.
I just said I'm trying to find new business models for my journalists. That's what I teach in my journalism school, and not to necessarily just preserve the old models that worked a century ago. I hope that you don't stand in the way of progress.
All right, Jeff Jarvis. Well, we'll certainly try to think outside the box as this world changes, and our jobs do too. I want to thank Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet. I also want to thank Waddick Doyle, Olivia Phillip, and from New York, Jeff Jarvis. I hope you stay dry there with the weather. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Good evening.